Hello everyone, and a warm welcome to our webinar. I'm Tracy Duncan, and on behalf of Australian War Widows New South Wales, I'm delighted to have you with us today. Before we begin today's session, and while everyone is still logging in and getting settled, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping items. First and foremost, please be advised this webinar will be recorded. We do this to ensure that those who couldn't make it today can catch up later or share this valuable content with friends and family. Now, throughout our discussion, we encourage you to engage with us. At the end of our presentation, we'll have a Q&A session where you can ask questions or share your thoughts. The Q&A section is down the bottom, and you click on the box and you ask your questions there. Please send in your queries and we'll do your best to address as many as we can at the end. Additionally, if you're looking for more ways to stay connected and informed, remember to join us on Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn. You can find us at AWW New South Wales. Plus, if you're interested in our exclusive community, Our Space, we have an online closed group on Facebook. You can easily access it through the QR code displayed on the closing screen. It's now time to get started on this thought-provoking and an insightful discussion. I'll now pass over to Renee Wilson. Good afternoon, Renee.
Good afternoon, Tracy, and thank you. Good afternoon, everyone out there joining us in this webinar and to our panellists. Before we kick off, let me start by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the lands on which we are gathering. Personally, I'm on the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I encourage any of you joining us here today on this webinar to also acknowledge the lands on which you are joining us from. And if you do know what they are and you wish to share that with the group, please do so in the chat or through the Q&A function. I'd like to thank our webinar support officer, Tracy, for providing us with an introduction and some general housekeeping. My name is Renee Wilson and I'm the CEO of Australian War Widows New South Wales. In this role, I am privileged to lead an organisation that is on an incredible pathway to make a positive impact in the lives of many veteran families in Australia. At War Widows New South Wales, we fundamentally believe that no person should be left behind or disadvantaged as a result of their loved one's service, whether they be widowed, the spouse of a veteran, of a current or former serving member, their children, their siblings or their parents. We are here for them today, tomorrow and always. In today's webinar, we're going to discuss something that as a community, I don't think we're very good at discussing, and that is the topic of grief and loss. It is a challenging topic, and for that reason, it's important to know where you can turn for support should this webinar raise anything uncomfortable for you, be those thoughts, feelings or memories. We are, of course, just at the end of the phone or the email. However, we are not a counselling or crisis support service. For such services, you can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14, Open Arms on 1800 011 046, or families of current serving members, you can contact the All Hours support line 1800 028 036. Don't worry, we will repeat those numbers at the end of the webinar. I'd now like to take a moment to introduce you to our panellists this afternoon. First, let me introduce you to Dr. Stephanie Hodgson. Stephanie is the current CEO of Relationships Australia Canberra and Region. She has lived experience of grief, bereaved by her son Christopher's suicide. She has worked for 30 years in psychology, mental health and community support, first in the army and then as a public servant, and now for a non-for-profit. She is a leader, committed to developing accessible and high quality services and support to families through all stages of life. During her career as an army psychologist, she attained the rank of colonel and head of the Australian Army Psychology Corps. She was a recipient of the Conspicuous Service Cross, or CSC, awarded for outstanding devotion to duty. Welcome, Steph.
Hi, Renee, and thanks for having me here today for this important topic.
Let me now introduce you to Michelle Carr. Michelle is a ceramic artist, widow, and member of War Widows New South Wales. She recently exhibited her ceramics graduation works at the Incinerator Art Gallery in Willoughby. Her exhibition, Reshaped, told the story of grief, hope, and the different directions that life spins us in. Michelle's art is informed by her lived experience and the elements of grief, energy, and life. In 2015, Michelle's life took an unexpected turn when her husband, Major Matthew Carr, a veteran in the Australian Army, passed away from service-related disease and injuries. At the time, their son was aged just 2 and their daughter 3 months old. Welcome, Michelle.
Hi, Renee. Thank you, everyone. Happy to be here.
Finally, let me introduce you to Lisa Stevenson. Lisa is the Manager of Social Work Programs at War Widows New South Wales. She's a qualified social worker and spouse of current serving Navy officer and mother of 2 children. Lisa has worked for over a decade in the child and family sector, specialising in parenting, relationships, child development and early intervention. She has her own lived experience of navigating family life and defence service, supporting herself and her children through a constantly changing family dynamic. Lisa brings this combination of personal and professional experience to offer holistic social work services here at War Widows New South Wales. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to be here.
Now, before we get into the discussion, I did want to take a moment to provide some context, because grief is one of those things that is most commonly associated with bereavement. And while we know that is the time at which this emotion can be incredibly difficult, intense and acute, it also exists in many other forms throughout our lives. And it could rise due to the loss of a loved one, but it could also arise anytime we experience the loss of something we care deeply about, like a relationship, a job, a pet, or something else entirely. The more significant the loss, the more intense the feeling of grief is likely to be. It can affect every part of your life and have a large impact on your mental health and well-being. Everyone experiences grief in different ways, and all of the ways are okay. There is no right or wrong way to grieve, and there are no right or wrong feelings. And while you are unlikely to ever forget your loss, you can find a way to live with it, to grow from it, with it, and through it. Grief and loss are particularly present in the lives of many of us as veteran families. Examples of the losses that we can experience in our community include the loss of a loved one due to a service-related incident, injury, or illness, the ending of a relationship or marriage breakdown, significant changes to your relationships caused by service-related incidents, injury, or illness, or those serving, those that are unaccompanied or experiencing high operational tempo or extended absences. We can experience it when our loved ones transition from defence service to civilian life. You can experience it with the loss of your career, job, or social connections caused by relocation when in service. You can also experience loss or significant changes to your personal network as a result of relocations, transitioning from military service, or the veteran's health. So with grief and loss so present in our lives, why don't we talk about it? Perhaps it's too confronting, and we only think of it in terms of bereavement. And we're also not sure we can ever live with it, that it can feel a little bit too uncomfortable. And so many of us just get busy instead. And perhaps when we do decide it's time to learn about how we're feeling, we reach for a book or we Google grief, and inevitably we will stumble across something called the 5 stages of grief. So I thought what we might do is start there. And Steph, I want to start with you if that's okay. Are there 5 stages of grief? And if so, what are they?
Renee, I think that's an excellent question, and it's probably one of the myths I most wanted to bust today. The 5 stages of grief from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was useful in the sense that it started to articulate what grief can look like. But the research she did was actually with people who were dying. So this was people who had an endpoint, which is why when you look at the 5 stages of grief, it's going through anger, denial, and finally acceptance. The problem with the 5 stages of grief is it suggests to all of us that there's some sort of path that we should be on. And as Renee said before, in reality, grief, there's no wrong way to do grief. And in fact, going through grief often means that, there are very big emotions and they come in waves rather than a stage. So the 5 stages of grief, whilst was a great starting point, has more recently been questioned because it creates a feeling in people that maybe they're failing if they're not reaching that acceptance that they're supposed to get to, when in reality, for anyone who's been through a major grief or loss will know that, in fact, it will probably be part of your life forever, which is why I quite like Tonkin's theory of grief, which is more about the idea that grief is something that we eventually learn to grow around. So grief is an emotion that initially, no matter what type of grief it is really large. Eventually, it's always there, but you actually grow around that grief to actually have other moments of joy. For example, a loss in the family or a separation or any type of grief but then a new baby comes along, you make room for that joy. So it's not that the grief is no longer there. It's that there's new emotions, positive emotions that can exist within that sort of circle of your life, if that makes sense. So I think the big takeaway for me around grief, and whether I'm working with grief or even having lived through it, is that it's okay to have lots of big emotions, and all of us cope differently. So, and one of the things I think about service life is, I know for me, every time we went on posting, I'm such a sook. So as we drove out of the town, I would always have a cry, and my husband would go, "Oh my God, she's doing it again." And because I would be sad about having left all my friends, as much as I'm excited about the next posting, as much as I'm excited about the next adventure we're going on, I'd have to also grieve. I love Darwin. I love living in Darwin. I'm now stuck in Canberra. But at the same time, you have these mixed emotions. And I think, it's one of the things I'm very aware of coming up to Christmas. I'm very excited about Christmas, but this is also the anniversary month of my son's death. So for me, it's always a time of very big emotions that can sit alongside each other. And it's really important to make space for both. So I suppose, Renee, one of my big things is the stages of grief was useful, and it's useful for naming emotions. But what I'd also say is that there are many big emotions. And it's really interesting because only just this week I was talking to my sister who lost her husband only about 3 months ago. And she's been reading those books, and she actually said to me, this book keeps saying to me, pay attention to the data. And what that actually means is, what are the little things when you're grieving that you experience and that you pay attention to? So for me, I know that even when I think it's okay, I'm probably better off this month in about a week from not being at work. For her, she's starting to pay attention to the things that make that grief bigger, so it expands out and takes up more of your life. If you want in order to be able to have space for joy, I still have 2 other boys, and I need to make the space for them. So I pay attention to myself, and I'd say this for other people. Pay attention to what are the ways you cope with grief, and then put in some strategies to deal with them. I know for me, some people need to do that self-care and disappear under a doona. That's okay. It's okay to spend a weekend watching Netflix because you're just too tired. Or if you're like me, I weed the garden, and my husband knows my grief has got a bit too much when I'm starting to talk again about taking out trees, not just plants. So it's paying attention to how you react, and then talking to your family about, actually, when I'm doing this, that means I'm starting to grieve again, and I need that space, but don't let it get out of control, because I actually do like my trees and my garden.
It's there was a lot in that, and if I can just take a moment, I think one of the things that you talked a lot about is holding that tension between these, I'm going to call them negative emotions, because that's how they feel, painful and negative sometimes, but also holding the tension with, it's okay to be joyful about something. And the lead up to Christmas, which is the example you gave, is perfect. I imagine that holding that tension also is like holding a piece of wool really tense too, right? Yeah. So maybe you do go into these other behaviors, and you do want to take some trees out. And how important is it for those around you to be gentle, and how can they best support you in that to help you release some of that tension?
Well, and I think, Renee, that's the thing, is that acknowledging it also is very tiring, that holding that tension is exhausting, which is why, even if you're someone who's an active coper, you still need to make time when you're grieving for whatever reason to actually also recover. So, and I think it's very true also when people leave the military, it's a major time of stress, because one day you are part of a team and you can walk on that base, and the next day you've no longer got a pass and all your friends are still on the base, but you're not part of that group anymore. It's a massive transition. And I think in that time, people often jump into the next job, but it's really important to actually make time for some self-care, because I'll be working with the tension of dealing with the loss, those emotions of loss and feeling rejection potentially, even though in your heart you shouldn't be feeling that way, but in reality you feel you're no longer part of the tribe quite the way that you used to be. You're excited about what's to come, and all of that is exhausting. So making those moments to just sit, acknowledge the emotion, be a little bit mindful, and then move forward can make the big difference. And just realizing it is all very tiring. I think that's the biggest thing, is making yourself space in that tension.
I think it's a major thing, because I think a lot of us get caught up in the whole sleep deprivation is a whole nother webinar, but I think a lot of us can get caught up in feeling guilty for feeling tired.
Well, that was my thing with the what comes with that joy also when you were talking about bereavement is then the guilt. How can I feel joy at a time when, it doesn't mean you're missing them any less. It's just the fact that your grief you're finally growing around that grief to be able to make space in your life for the joys, but then comes the guilt. And it's real,
Just one point before I come to you, Michelle. You mentioned about acknowledging how you're feeling and paying attention to the data. Practically, I can think of one way off the top of my head, but practically, how do people do that? What are the ways that you see work for people to be able to do that? Is it sitting? Is it journaling? Is it talking to someone?
I think all those things, depending on whether you're a writer, but I think the most important thing you can do, and I think, again, thinking about the strengths that military families can actually build on, is that thing, as you move between postings, you do it together. It's that moment where you start talking about, so the more you can communicate and tell people how you're feeling, even when you don't necessarily want to, it's so important. And if you do it on the little things, that would be my observation. If you practice it with postings and you practice like planning things together and saying, hey, look, you can pick it when I'm stressed. You know that when I've disappeared in the middle of the night into my books, it's because I'm probably grieving. When the really big one happens, you've got a better chance of staying together as a family. And it's sometimes impossible because people grieve in such different ways. But if you practice communication with your family and just regular willingness to talk about big feelings, it means that when you really, really need it, you might have half a chance of doing it.
We might have to get you back about how to talk about big feelings, because it's not, again, that's a whole nother topic, and it's incredibly complex, because where do you start when you're not even sure yourself?
Yeah.
Michelle, I'm going to bring you in here. You have experienced grief following the loss of your husband. How has it impacted you? And most importantly, how have you grown around it or integrated it into your life?
Yeah, thank you, Renee. I think the biggest thing for me was the amount of time this grief journey has taken and how much of my life it has actually consumed. My husband served in the army for 19 years. And when he passed away, like you mentioned before, our children were quite young, 3 months and 2 years old. So when Matt first passed away, I was still, breastfeeding our daughter, had a young toddler, still physically recovering from childbirth. And I actually was just in a complete state of shock. Matt had been sick pretty much every 3 years, and he'd always recovered. So when he passed away, my world fell apart because I just was not prepared for it at all. And I think one of the things I found was that I was in a constant state of fight or flight. And we were still in the same house that he had been quite sick in. So, every single room there was a reminder of how sick he was. He didn't pass away in the house, so that was helpful in terms of my recovery. But I guess I realized I just felt in the first stages of grief, any little comments people would make to me would just tend to stick to me. I just had no capacity for any little flippant remarks or little comments to bounce off. Everything just weighed heavy and heavier. I know we talk about waves of grief, but I feel like I was probably in a very big state of shock and depression, and all of those feelings and emotions do take a lot of time. So I guess I realized at about the 3-year point when my son was about to start kindergarten. The school that I had picked was actually right opposite the church where Matt's funeral had been. And a lot of people said, oh, maybe that's a nice positive sign. And I realized that we really needed to physically move. So at the time we were in Port Stephens and we relocated back to Sydney. And I think having that physical move probably helped in a very big way. And the kids were starting to get a little bit younger. So, a little bit older. So Mason started kindergarten, Monique started some daycare. And I guess I had the capacity then to start, focusing on myself and looking at ways to rebuild my life. So I guess one of the most important things for me was seeking professional help. I see a psychologist every 3 weeks, and I have since we moved to Sydney. So we've been in Sydney for 5 years. So Matt's coming up to almost 9 years since he passed away. And I'm always surprised kind of when I say that, how long this grief journey has taken me. But I guess if I look at it in terms of my children, my daughter Monique is now 9. So every time she turns 9, we have that kind of reminder, well, another 3 months, that's when your dad would have passed. And it's not that we want to focus on these things. It kind of just happens as signposts throughout the year for us. And I think also in terms of being a military family, even though Matt has passed, we still identify with being a military family. So, we're part of War Widows, we're part of Legacy, we turn up to all these events. So that in itself means we have a lot of public grief. So when we go to Anzac Day, we grieve publicly. When the kids have Anzac Day services at their school, they grieve. So I guess it's a little bit different compared to their peers who have lost a parent, because, we seem to be grieving a lot. We have Anzac Day, we have Father's Day, we have birthdays, we have Remembrance Day. So there just seems to be, at this point in my children's lives, 9 and 11, we're putting on the medals a lot. And I guess in a way it's positive, because we are constantly talking about Matt and our journey, and we're talking about our emotions and our feelings. And, we are actively looking at ways to stay connected with our military community and also find the support. My children go to grief counselling. We go to a place called the National Centre for Childhood Grief. I realised my kids were asking questions that were just too hard for me to answer. I felt that I was getting too emotional and I needed somebody else to gently talk to them about grief. At that centre, they bury little treasures in sand, and they talk about digging for memories in the sand. And usually when they come back and talk to me, they say, your kids are fine. And I think, okay, thank you. I'm not part of those sessions, but I know I'm doing whatever I can as we progress along our stages of grief to try to make sure that the kids are communicating their feelings, and that we're definitely talking about Matt and him still being a part of our family. So in terms of my therapy, I started once the kids started school. Mason started kindergarten in 2015. I started a basic ceramics course at TAFE. I knew I just didn't have the capacity to go back to the corporate world. So I started a basic ceramics course, quite enjoyed that. Then built on that. That was an 8-week course. And then I did another 8 weeks. And then I started an intermediate course. And I guess I moved from the intermediate to the diploma, and now I've just finished the advanced diploma. So that 5-year journey helped me to build my own resilience, build more of a sense of identity. I guess one of the biggest things for me was being a military spouse was I lost my identity altogether. And then when Matt passed away, I found that there really wasn't much left of me apart from the grief and the young children. So ceramics has provided me with a new focus and identity, and I love it. I love being able to create beautiful things. I love being able to use my art to now talk about grief and how it has actually helped me. And I think people could probably choose any course. I've benefited amazingly from going to TAFE. Like, there are TAFE facilities all around New South Wales in all different country towns. They offer so many different courses, and I just reconnected with a lovely community, and I had somewhere to go 3 days a week, and that provided me with an outlet. It provided me with space to call my own, that nobody could kind of take over. Sorry, I'm studying ceramics, and having that kind of boundary helped me to actually have me time. So my journey has been quite big. I'm excited for the next part. Now that I've finished this course, I'm not sure what that's going to be, but so I found I guess the therapeutic side with the arts has been really amazing. And I guess from my kids' point of view, they've been on this journey with me as well, and watched me, create things in our small unit and then have them in an exhibition space. And I don't think many of us get to have our children actually say to us very often that, Mum, I'm really proud of you. And, that's been really special for me as well.
I love that. Again, there's so much in what you just shared, but it all kind of, for me in listening to that, there were really important things along the way. There was the language you used around our journey of grief, that real personalization, that this is about us as a family. And, I think one of the things that you first mentioned when you said that you had to move, you put a very big physical boundary around that very big event and emotion. And then I can see how you've carried that through. And not only are you creating space and supporting your children to make sure that they get to know Dad, they now get to see you because you found you. And that's just incredibly inspiring. It's, I don't want it to be like one of the things that you probably heard in the early days that you were just like, shut up. But it is. It honestly is, because I think what you're doing is really demonstrating how, through different types of boundaries, you can actually live with this thing, but you can integrate it in a really meaningful way. And I think one of the most powerful things you said was, when he passed, there was nothing left of me. And you've been on this journey to re-find you, which is just incredible. And one of the most challenging things, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And yes, my kids do see a lot of me. We downsized from a 4-bedroom house to a small 2-bedroom unit. And I think that's the ongoing discussion I have with my kids as well. If I want to do ceramics, which is important to me, we need to make sacrifices. And that's okay, because in the future, if it's important for you to have a big house, then you can have a big house. But at the moment, this is the way we're doing it. And, hopefully things might change. But I think when you have had big life changes and you realize what is important. And I think sometimes we can get caught up and lost in the busyness of the life. And the fact that when Matt passed away, you know, I pretty much gave away like half of our house to relocate, to downsize. You know, I gave away all of his clothes, and you know, I think, you know, there's little stages on your grief journey that are particularly hard, but they also, if there can be a blessing or a silver lining, I would never have gotten to this place of gratitude or contentment without having this life experience. And, you know, not that I would wish this on anyone as their journey. And I think, you know, in terms of like recovery and where do you go from here and helping others, you know, I guess I'm in a really good place that, you know, I can now do that.
It's an incredible story, and thank you for sharing a lot about your children and Matt as well. Lisa, that was a lot about integration, really, which goes to the centre of my question for you. And we heard a real life experience about living alongside and living with grief. But I'm wondering from you, can you share with us, is there any other ways that you've noticed in your practice as a social worker that people can live alongside grief, and where and how do they access supports, and what types of supports are probably best?
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, I want to preface this by saying that I don't view myself as an expert on grief, as most social workers would say. And I think we've just heard the reason why, and that's because we're constantly amazed and inspired by the ways that people integrate their grief. And I think we all are the experts on our own grief journey. And my job is simply to gently guide everybody on their grief journey towards a path that really supports their well-being. And well-being is, you know, the center of what we care about and what we're looking for. And so I think Steph had highlighted, and it kind of made me think about, I see grief and loss as a spectrum. And I think it's really important to mention that again, just because it can be really hard sometimes to talk about other losses outside of bereavement. And I think I just wanted to highlight that hard is hard. And so it's really important to talk about those challenges around all the different types of loss so that we can really honour each of them accordingly. The word resilience is often used a lot to describe defence and veterans families. And we know that resilience is born out of discomfort and challenge, lots of challenge. And so learning to deal with or cope through those smaller challenges along the journey can really help us to support ourselves and each other and other people through those larger losses later. And so I guess, you know, to answer the question, how do we do that? 3 really key factors. So social connection, good mental health support, and physical health support. So we might be looking at, for social connection, building a village, number 1. So making sure, if we don't already have a village, to build that in and be really intentional about that. It might be loved ones, peer groups, you know, other grieving families as well, or it might be professionals. That's okay too. Everybody's village is going to look really different. Joining groups, so saying yes to groups, spending time with loved ones. And so for mental health support, we might be looking at a trusted psychologist or counsellor. We've just heard from Michelle how crucial that has been to her journey, and that of her children too. So getting the children involved as well. You might be confiding in trusted people. It could be loved ones, it could be family, friends. And then there's tools. So meditation, breath work, mindfulness. There's so many people offering those tools as well, but certainly you could start with your trusted psychologist or counsellor. And then physical health support, I really just want to take it back to basics. So sleep hygiene, so important to get enough sleep. Exercise, daily exercise. It doesn't have to be, you know, what it was before. It could just be, you know, a gentle walk, preferably with somebody would be amazing, because then you're connecting all 3 of those, the social connection, mental health support with a trusted loved one, and moving your body. And then just the basic ones, nutrition and hydration, and asking for that support. So I guess when we feel the need for that extra support, it's really important to put our hand up and say, I really need that extra support. And here at AWWNSW, we provide a real person-centered social work service. It is not a one-size-fits-all approach. We are very lucky to be able to be flexible enough to provide that service. And so our service might include information and referral, either internally or to other services. We might support families with complex service navigation because it can be incredibly overwhelming. And then support in the form of regular phone conversations with myself or somebody else from the team. And so we support grieving families to build their village. That's number one, the most important thing. The first question I'll ask is, who's visiting, who's in your life, who did you last see, those types of questions. Maintaining good mental, physical health, and then holding space for whatever might be coming up for them at any given time. Super, super important.
It's amazing to me just hearing you mention that, in particular around the physical health. It's not something you often think about. Well, I don't know, you do, but you're probably like me, just like, whatever, there'll be time for that later, because right now I need to be here for my children, or, you know, my in-laws, or, you know, all these other people around, and very, very few people include you. And I don't know, Steph, Michelle, how often did you eat? Or did you forget? Yeah. To me, I guess where I was going with that was, it amazes me how we don't think necessarily about physical health, but it also tends to be the one thing people go to try and help support you, is they'll cook for you.
Yeah. Yeah. But also, I think a big thing is the fact that don't let people, I think the trouble is you're doing so much in that first bit, just coping, as Michelle said, trying to just get your head around it, that it is so easy to give up on the physical. So I think it was really great that Lisa mentioned it. I was very naughty. I stopped I had a rebellion against the world and stopped taking all my medications for a year. And then a friend who's a really good GP she picked it up and she went, "Enough, you're not allowed to do this." And then I had to spend 4 years undoing the damage I did during that time. So I think it's really important. Don't let your friends get away with it. How can you be a good friend? If you're noticing someone never walks anymore when they always went running, they've all of a sudden just stopped everything because it's too easy to do that. Like, as you said, Renee, you're giving to everyone else and then there's nothing left for you. And then I used physical as a rebellion mechanism, you know, to sort of tell the world I'm not just ignoring you, but then that causes you even worse problems. So if you can walk alongside someone, even if it's go for a walk around the shop, get the dog out for a walk, get them to go and take a walk along the beach with you. It's what they really need. The physical is so important, but I think it is also in grief one of the first things that can go. And it's one of the few things you can control. The trouble is, you know, your own body is something you can control. And then if you want to rebel, it's a good way to rebel. Well, it's not a good way. It's a very easy way to rebel when it's actually, just as my advice, the damage it does, then you have to, then it's to get back fit, trying to get your fitness back afterwards. And like Michelle said, it can take years. You know, the first year is, I think, just coping. Year 2, you start to do things.
Yeah. And I think for me as well, you know, look, I lived a very social life before, you know, so, you know, in terms of catching up with people, it was always, you know, wine was involved and drinking, and, you know, I would have a glass of wine at the end of the night to cope. And then I realized again, like the physical side of things, it was, okay, well, I can't cope unless I've had a glass of wine. So, you know, now I can identify and have that level of self-awareness that, you know, if I've got something important coming up, I won't drink, you know. And I think like in the early stages of grief, you know, socially we accept drinking, and, you know, we definitely in the military side of things, you know, I know my husband, like, you know, they would all get together and that'd just be it. They would come together, they kind of drink, they get drunk, you know, doesn't matter what happens, you know, it's almost like this, I don't know what you'd call it, but, you know, it's part of the bonding, it's part of the ritual and the culture. And so I guess if you're with if you're grieving, just offer alternatives, like Lisa suggested, meet for a cup of tea, go for a walk on the beach. It doesn't have to involve, alcohol, or if you getting to that point, just, I guess that's self-check, what am I missing out on by sleeping the next day? Or, in my case, it wasn't really possible because I had young kids. So, I think other things to provide joy into your life as well. And I think in terms of, what can we do that's practical? I know, at Matt's funeral, I was really sad because there were all these beautiful flowers. And I thought, oh, it's a bit like Matt's never going to buy me flowers like Miley Cyrus, I can buy my flowers,
Yeah.
so like, it's just like remembering that you can do simple things, like having a beautiful fresh bunch of flowers in the house is not indulgence. It is, if you don't have them in the garden, it's okay to have those small little things just to bring that bit of joy inside. And it's not a waste of money.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And it's amazing the constructs we put around things that we don't do things for ourselves because we're conditioned to expect others to do them for us. But if we can't do it for ourselves, then who will? So I think there's a really beautiful message in that. I'm going to open it up to the group and see if there are any questions. If you do have a question and you're joining us here today, please use the Q&A function, which appears next to the chat. And the questions will come through to me. And when they do, I will ask them of the panelists, but I'm going to keep everyone talking. So think of your questions and push them through. We've got about 15 minutes or so plenty of time for questions to come through. There was a lot in that to unpack. And Lisa, you talked about social connection. I heard that as part of something that helped Michelle as well. And I'm wondering, Steph, how did you go with social connection? You mentioned moving between places, leaving your family behind. How did you go about recreating that for yourself?
I must admit, I think it's one of the strengths of our military family is we have a shared language, and I'm still fascinated that fact that my kids would go to a school and there'd be kids from all walks of life, but all their friends they brought home seemed to be in the military. Parents were in the military, and I think there's something about
my
the
kids
language.
are like that too.
No, there's a common language that comes in families. So we always made an effort to always, when we came to a new place, we breed German Shepherd dogs, and so we've always been involved in the local German Shepherd dog club. But I also think there's a lot to be said for making sure that you are active, because then when something really bad happens, I must admit, the drop-ins, that tribe that comes around you, that makes you go for walks, that turns up, and so I think embedding, even though it's hard moving around as military families, getting involved in the PMC, getting involved in, the dog club did so much from us. Our son was very actively involved in the Canberra Bush, the bushies out at Hall, and they were just a godsend for us when we really needed them. They turned up, they organised the wake, they did all sorts of amazing things for us. So I think that building a tribe, Lisa's right, the little investments you make at any point in your life in making sure that you're part of your local community makes all the difference on the days when you really need it. And then also the fact that you can give back. So those moments in your own community where, what I've realized now is if something bad happens with someone, I don't wait for them to reach out to me. The things I valued was the person who just appeared with a pot plant for 5 minutes, or the person who knocked on the front door and said, hey, we want to take, your trailer's been out there for a week, the neighbours around the corner, we want to take it to the dump for you. It's that practical things that you can reach in to do for others that reminds them they're actually in a community. And I think we got that a bit in COVID. I think as military families, you have to work that little bit harder. When you go to a new posting, you've got to connect, and the school can do that for you. I love the fact Michelle's found it through art and a community there. You've got to build little villages, and I loved what Lisa said, because how do you change your behavior? You name it, you tell someone you're going to do it, and then you actually have to come through and tell that person you did it. And I love when Lisa said you can ring more widows, and you can get someone to, you can make that promise to someone and follow through with them, or whether it's your GP. But I think all of us can sit on the couch and think about doing stuff, or we can just tell someone we're going to do it and get them to promise to check in with us that we actually do it.
Steph, when you said it's that person that knocks on the door with a pot plant, you triggered a memory in me when we were in Holsworthy, and my husband was just going back to work following his accident, and I experienced my very first miscarriage, and I felt so alone in that experience. And there was a knock at the door one day. I was off work, waiting for the surgery to have it removed, and here is a army wife that I think I met once before with a plant, and it was one of the only times I think I felt so incredibly supported, and that plant still takes pride of place in our home. It thrives. It's called Potty, and it's the best thing. And I look at that now with complete fondness and gratitude. And I think, you know, if there's one message, and we'll get to it later, at least from my perspective, it's just being courageous to do that thing for someone.
Yeah.
Is incredible.
Lean in.
Lean in. There we go. So one of the questions that has come through, and Lisa, I'll probably get your thoughts, not thoughts, first on this one. It kind of goes exactly to this. So how do you support someone through their grief journey if they don't realise how much it's actually affecting them and they don't want to talk about it?
I mean, I think there's a few different approaches for that. My approach would be to hold space and wait, because you can't force it. People are going to go through their journey, their unique journey, at the time and the pace that they're going to. And so just those acts of, I think, you know, we've had this Are You Okay Day for a number of years now, and I think we've gotten good at asking the questions. I think there are other ways to ask the question. I think there are actions, there are big actions we can take to show people they matter, to show them we care, and we just wait for it to unfold naturally as it's supposed to.
Michelle, do you have any thoughts on that one?
I think it's important. I know with my own grief journey, you know, I felt like every day was, in the beginning, every day was just a day. So if I had a good day today, didn't necessarily mean that tomorrow was going to be a good day. So I was actually surprised with the big, you know, ups and downs that I had in those early years. The first year was just kind of survival. The second year was, oh my goodness, like this is the reality of it. You know, so I think one of the things that I use now as a coping mechanism in terms of, you know, what we're talking about, connection and support, I'm a part of a number of different organizations, and, you know, I look forward to those events. You know, of course, I've got to turn up on my own because that's just how this is. But, you know, the invitations, I think in the beginning when you're in a grieved state, or in mine, I had 2 young children, and, you know, it was, oh, someone else is taking care of her, or she'll be okay. There was, you know, people would come to the house and say, oh, look, you're doing such a great job. I think they thought they were like pumping me up, but there was no space for me to actually say, I need help, or I'm not doing okay, because they just kept telling me that I was doing such a great job. So I think, you know, like Lisa said, it's like sitting with that person, actually letting them talk and tell you how they're feeling, you know, and, you know, you might have checked in last week, or just keep checking in. And I think it's having events that you know that are coming up, that you kind of have to force yourself to attend, to structure your life around, to get a babysitter, to kind of force yourself back into society, to start living again. Those are the things that have helped me to actually just, yeah, I guess, not to keep yourself accountable, just know that, you know, this is a long journey and a long process, and, you know, you do have to make behavioral changes to get your life back, or to live around your grief. So that's what I found quite helpful.
Thank you. And what I heard there was pulling out both sides of it. So I think Lisa talked about holding space, and then you built on that around it's important to have that person to come and hold space, but I need to put myself out there too. Steph, I'm assuming at Relationships Australia you see this too when you're talking and trying to work through relationships and you're dealing with different forms of grief and loss. Do you have any thoughts you want to share on that?
I suppose we've covered off some really big griefs. You know, Renee, thank you for sharing about your miscarriage, because it's a grief we don't talk about, and I think there's the same thing. There's different griefs that as a group we don't talk about, and then there's, like, you know, when people separate, and for whatever reason, sometimes people can feel shame about that, even though so many families, you know, go in different directions at different points, and the same goes for, you know, someone like my son who died by suicide. You know, there's so much stigma around suicide. And I think that one of the things I would say is, whether it's through Relationships Australia or no matter what the grief is, and I love the holding space, but also making it possible for people to talk about, making the time to, just when we check in with people, what is going on in your life, but also making it possible for them. I think sometimes we need to talk about some of these things like miscarriage, suicide, because otherwise everyone just holds them in the background. You know, there's no shame with separating, or, you know, or I think what is amazing is when people step forward and actually say, you know, the courage is to step forward and say, I'm not coping as well as I want to as a parent and I need some help. Or I wish I was coping. I'm supposed to be a psychologist and I should be coping with my grief, but in fact I've stopped taking any medication, so I'm not coping at all. You know, and thank God I had a GP who slapped me about and told me, you know, so I think it's about constantly communicating, but communicating a little bit more deeper than, you know, just how are you today? You know, how is things really going? And the last thing I would say is, but also just making the opportunity available, not for 1 year, 2 years, but sometimes, I think, Michelle, you really said it, a 9-year journey. You know, I've talked to women who've lost someone 30 years ago, and, you know, they still wake up. That, I think the thing is, every single day when you've had a significant grief, at some point when you start a new day, you are reminded of it, and it never goes away. It's just making sure that we've made enough space, or our tribe creates the space for joy to come through and for us to feel okay about having both emotions there at the same time.
Thank you. We've got another question through here. And I'd like to thank this attendee for sharing their experience. They're talking about, there's a bit of context here and we don't have time to go through all of it, but effectively they're talking about the compounding effect of grief over time and multiple losses, and how at the time of one loss, I was so busy being a parent, trying to keep a relationship with in-laws and relocating, re-establishing a career, and then the lack of processing of smaller griefs and losses that came along over time. And now with the loss of a significant relationship, I feel like I've hit a wall of grief and need suggestions. And I guess this kind of comes to one of my last questions for you all as well, which is, what are the suggestions when you feel like you've hit this wall, and what is one thing that we can be doing for ourselves or for others? You know, if I was this person's best friend, what could I be doing to help? And what's one thing that this person could do to actually help themselves sort of break through that wall that they're feeling in front of? Steph, I'm going to start with you.
I'm going to do the obvious one, which is, it is okay no matter at what point to go and actually talk to someone, and to always remember that talking to a counsellor or a psychologist or a GP, it doesn't matter who you talk to, who knows about unpacking trauma, multiple layered traumas. It's a relationship. So sometimes the first person you go and talk to, you will not click with. But if you try a couple of different people, I would never have thought that play therapy would be my thing. But I have a friend who does sand pits, and I needed something that was not too cognitive. I needed to get more in touch with my emotions. I'm far too, you know, I think that I know the theory, but I wasn't experiencing the emotion. So I would really encourage people to go, as both Michelle and Lisa said, it's okay to go and talk to a professional, but don't think the first professional will be the right one. And sometimes it's about finding, like Michelle said, a release for those emotions. Because I think the trouble is when you've been busy and you're an operant coper and you've had to cope, that doesn't mean that you haven't had those emotions have been locked away in a little box. And at some point, processing them becomes really important, because what we found, even with veterans, with elderly people, it's when you slow down that they all come out. So whether you find writing helps, art helps, or talking to someone, it can make a huge difference. Eventually, we've got to all process them at some level. And bizarrely, I found play therapy worked, but for everyone, it's something different.
You know what, Steph? I think that's a really important point, because not all types of therapy will work for all types of people, and I really commend you for continuing to keep going to find something that got cut through for you. And I think, you know, as a psychologist, I can imagine, you know, the walls and the dissonance that's put up for you to find something to get cut through. And I hope that helps. You know, we've talked about some other ways to break through, but I think experimenting with different types of therapies, different types of professionals to just help you get that breakthrough. But most importantly, know that you're not alone, and perhaps that first thing that you need to do to get that little spark and that little breakthrough, the wall or the clouded sky, if that's how you want to think of it, is to have a conversation first and foremost. We are running out of time, and I desperately wanted to bring Lisa and Michelle into this, but I am going to hold there because I am desperately trying to stick to time, and I could keep talking to you all for hours. So I will pause it there. Thank you so very much to each of you for sharing your thoughts, your experiences, and your knowledge with us so candidly today. These webinars and events and sessions are only ever as good as how much the panelists are willing to share, and I'm incredibly grateful for how much each and every one of you has shared, some of it deeply personal, but incredibly practical for everyone that was listening today. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us online today, and thank our panelists again, our team who brought this together in the background, Tracy, Carolyn and Lisa. The phone numbers that I mentioned earlier are now being displayed in case this conversation has raised any uncomfortable thoughts, feelings or memories for you. Please do reach out and know first and foremost you are absolutely not alone. And I'll also say that these phone numbers are incredibly important, not just if you are in crisis, they're also important when you're not. You know, if you're looking for ways to help you navigate these waves of grief or these big feelings or these uncomfortable thoughts, people on the other end of these lines are there to help you navigate through that as well. And I certainly know if there was one thing that I got out of today's session, it is that grief and loss is normal. We all experience it, sometimes more intensely than others, but it is present because we are human, and it's very present in our community as defence and veteran families. And while we are stoic and resilient as family members, we also deserve support ourselves, and we deserve to make ourselves our own priority. And I hope that you found some wisdom in today's session or felt some sort of support that I talked about before through the panelists demonstrating their understanding and talking about their experiences. So until next time, I'd like to thank you very much again for joining us today, and good evening.